Hello everyone, I hope you're all having a great day. For this presentation, we'll be providing a summary for our Week 9 reading, Her Body, Himself, Gender in the Slasher Film by Carol J. Clover. I'm Kyle Mathers, and I'll be joined by Christina and Isaiah, and without further ado, let's get started. We'll begin with a brief bio on Clover, who was born on July 31st, 1940, and is an American professor of film studies, rhetoric, language, and Scandinavian mythology. She is widely recognized for her 1992 book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws: Gender in the Modern Horror Film, and this achieved substantial success and developed her final girl theory, which altered readers' conceptions of gender in slasher films. According to Clover, slasher films can be defined as the immensely generative story of a psycho killer who slashes to death a string of mostly female victims one by one until he is himself subdued or killed, usually by the one girl who has survived. Clover observes how slasher films are often disregarded by critics and scholars, and she explains how one could consider the Texas Chainsaw Massacre to be the Gone with the Wind of meat movies, while another could describe it as a vile little piece of sick crap. With the immense popularity of slasher films, their presence cannot be ignored. Slasher films present audiences with a world in which masculinity and femininity are more states of mind than body.
The thesis that Clover presents in her article is that the crudity and compulsive repetitiveness of slasher films provides the audience with a clearer view of culture and sexual attitudes, more than legitimate films from traditional studios.
According to Clover, the slasher film is drenched in taboo and approaches vigorously on the pornographic. She argues that both horror and pornography can be classified as sensation genres, as they are the only genres that are specifically devoted to the arousal of bodily sensation and exist solely to horrify and stimulate. She also argues that horror films respond to interpretation. Its engagement of repressed desires and fears, as well as its reenactment of the residual conflict surrounding those feelings, creates a fusion made possible by the shared structures of a common ideology. She also examines that the basic structure of horror is fixed and fundamental. The cinematic conventions of horror are so often easily parodied, it would suggest that in some sense there is no original or right text, but only variants. There are three cinematic categories which are comprised of the civilized side of the continuum, which lie within the legitimate genres. Contrastly, on the opposing side lie the sensation or body genres, encompassing horror and adult films. Both these genres are specifically devoted to the arousal of bodily sensations that are witnessed when the body is in intercourse or feeling threatened. Therefore, they exist solely to horrify and stimulate viewers, not always respectively, but it remains their sole measure of their success as they prove of themselves upon our pulses. As a result, when horror film fans say it was good, it means scary, specifically in a bodily way, whereas adult films rely on the level of arousal that is provoked in their audience.
Clover uses Hitchcock's Psycho as an example to demonstrate all of the familiar elements of a slasher film. Firstly, the killer is the psychotic product of a sick family, but still recognizably human. The victim is a beautiful, sexually active woman. The location is not home, opting for a setting of a terrible place. The weapon is something other than a gun. The attack is from the victim's point of view and comes as a shock. The unprecedented success of Hitchcock's particular formulation influenced a flood of imitations. Following Psycho, Clover describes two emerging works that revise the template introduced by Hitchcock. These films include the Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974 and Halloween from 1978, which are two successful slasher films. In the usual way of folklore, these two slasher films contemporize not only Hitchcock's terms, but also their own.
The cinematic conventions of horror are easily and often parodied, suggesting that its basic structures are fixed and fundamental. Clover provides an example of how Friday the 13th and Halloween essentially have the same story that is compulsively repeated in all their follow-ups with only minor variations in plot. The audience for this is primarily young males who cheer on the killer as they slaughter their victims, then switch sides to rally behind the remaining survivor as they take down the killer.
In terms of cinematography, slasher films employ point-of-view shots from the perspective of the killer as he tracks down his victims. At first glance, the audience may jump to the conclusion that they are being persuaded to identify with the killer. However, Clover claims otherwise, stating that these shots give the viewer an opportunity to establish a connection to the killer in regards to perceiving them as an intimidating threat. Furthermore, towards the climax, the point-of-view shots start to belong to the final girl. This is in order to disassociate the audience from the perspective of the killer and persuade them into rooting for the final girl as she prepares to take on the killer. In horror, females were initially presented as passively waiting for a male to save them. However, now they have begun to actively fight back against the killer on their own, becoming a final girl. According to Clover, the idea of the final girl theory dictates that there is always a girl who lives to the end and confronts the killer. This girl should stereotypically be brunette, intelligent, and appear sensible and sexually unavailable compared to her friends who will all gradually be killed. The final girl is often represented as masculine and should even be given a name typically associated with males such as Charlie, Alex, or Sydney. The gender of the final girl is offset by her lack of femininity, which is clearly seen in the active investigating gaze. This is traditionally reserved for males, however the final girl takes on these traits, which include searching for the killer and even tracking him down. And then in the final scene, she stops screaming, looks at the killer, and addresses them on her own terms with a weapon of her choice. Now we'll take a look at a clip of the final girl in action.
Oh, Stu, what's your motive? Billy's got one, the police are on their way. What are you gonna tell them?
Peer pressure. I'm far too sensitive.
I'm gonna rip you up, you bitch! Just like your fucking mother!
You gotta find me first, you pansy-ass mama's boy!
Fuck! Fucking hit me with a phone, dick! Fucker, where are you? You fuck!
Call the police.
You missed your sorry ass, I did.
My mom and dad are gonna be so mad.
Bitch! I always had a thing for you, Sid!
In your dreams.
This clip demonstrates the transformation of the stereotypical female victim into a final girl. In this scene from the original Scream 1996, we see Sidney Prescott fight back against the two Ghostface killers, Billy Loomis and Stu Macher. This takes the idea of the final girl being represented as masculine to an entirely other level by having Sidney don the Ghostface outfit and intimidate both the killers, thereby flipping the power dynamics of the film. In conclusion, Clover brings attention to the emerging pattern in the horror genre where the male killer with feminine traits is ultimately defeated by the female protagonist with masculine traits, thereby triggering a loosening of the equation sex equals gender. By exploring this concept of cross-gender identification, Clover concludes that the final girl is an agreed-upon fiction, not a feminist character. Instead, her function is to act as a vehicle for the male viewer's own sadomasochistic fantasies. Thank you all for listening to our presentation. I hope you enjoyed, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.